Number 10. Raqefet Cave beer. The funeral drink older than farming in a cave on Mount Carmel, long before cities, temples, or written prayer. People gathered around their dead with stone vessels sunk into the rock. The place is called Raqefet Cave, and it belonged to the Natufians, hunter-gatherers of the Levant living at the threshold of a world about to change. They had not yet become the farmers who would transform human history. Yet inside this burial cave they left behind evidence of something startlingly familiar. A drink brewed from grain, likely served during rituals for the dead nearly 13,000 years ago. The discovery did not begin with a decorated cup or sealed jar of liquid. It began inside stone mortars, heavy basins carved into bedrock and boulders within a cemetery context. Researchers studied microscopic residues, starch damage and wear patterns, then compared them with experimental processing of wild cereals. The traces suggested that the Natufians malted wheat or barley, crushed and heated plant material, and produced a fermented beverage with a thick porridge-like consistency. This was not the clear beer of a later tavern. It was something older and more intimate, prepared where bodies were laid to rest. That context changes everything. Fermentation is often imagined as a product of agriculture and surplus harvests, something that came after humans planted fields. Raqefet Cave suggests a darker reversal. Before cereals were domesticated in the Near East, wild grain may already have been gathered and transformed for ceremonial drink. People may not have brewed because they had agriculture. The desire to feast, mourn and share an altered state around the dead may have been one reason grain became valuable in the first place. The Natufians were already living differently from many earlier hunter-gatherers. They established enduring places, buried their dead in carefully arranged cemeteries, and returned to locations invested with memory. At Raqefet Cave, graves were associated with flowers, stone installations and plant preparation. Imagine the gathering without pretending we can know every detail. Relatives entering a cool cave, the scent of crushed vegetation and damp stone, a thick fermented drink portioned out near graves once lined with flowers. The alcohol may not have been overwhelmingly strong, but strength is not the only reason a substance matters. In ritual, even a modest change in mood and perception can turn burial into an encounter with something larger than grief. What makes this case so unsettling is that the beverage survives only through traces left in stone. No Natufian voice explains whether the drink was meant for mourners, ancestors, spirits, or all of them at once. There is no hymn telling us what they felt as they drank it, no rule naming who prepared it, and no testimony revealing whether intoxication was sought deliberately or simply accompanied the feast. Archaeology can identify malted cereal traces and reconstruct likely brewing processes. It cannot recover the moment when a living person raised a vessel beside a grave and believed the dead were still present. Even the word beer can mislead if it makes the ritual feel ordinary. This was not a casual beverage produced after a day of work. It required gathering wild cereals, processing them, preparing containers, and carrying that labor into a burial place. In a world before cultivated grain could be harvested by the field, every batch represented time and collective purpose. Whatever was served inside Raqefet Cave mattered because it transformed ordinary plants into an experience shared at the border between life and death. There is also a profound mystery hidden in the order of events. Civilization is often told as a practical progression. People learned to farm, grain became abundant, and eventually they discovered beer. But Raqefet invites another possibility. Humans may have valued fermented drink while they were still foragers, because it strengthened gatherings, marked loss, and made the unseen feel closer. Farming may have been driven partly by hunger, but the earliest known evidence for cereal-based brewing rests beside the dead, not in a granary. The substance in these mortars was not a violent poison or a drug strong enough to erase reality. Its darkness lies somewhere deeper. It suggests that the human impulse to chemically reshape grief is older than agriculture itself. Before people raised cities to honor the dead, they may have gathered in a cave and prepared a drink beside them. The vessels are empty now, the mourners are gone, and whatever meaning passed between them has been buried beyond recovery. Yet in the microscopic scars left inside stone, the funeral feast still lingers, the first shadow in this investigation, and a reminder that humanity may have begun brewing not only to celebrate life, but to endure the presence of death. Number 9. Cahokia Black Drink. The caffeine ritual of America's lost city near the Mississippi River, opposite modern St. Louis. An ancient city once rose with a scale that still unsettles the history of North America. Cahokia was not a scattered village or temporary gathering place. At its height around the 11th and 12th centuries, it was an urban center of earthen pyramids, plazas, timber structures and ceremonial spaces. Thousands of people lived within its influence. Then, centuries before European colonization transformed the region, the city declined and its rituals fell silent. Among the objects recovered from Cahokia were small ceramic beakers unlike ordinary cooking vessels. They were carefully made, sometimes marked with imagery connected to water and the underworld, and found in settings linked to gathering and ceremony. For years, they could only suggest that an important drink had once been served inside them. Then chemical analysis reached into residues absorbed by the pottery and uncovered a revealing combination: caffeine, theobromine and ursolic acid. Biomarkers pointing toward a beverage made from holly leaves. The plant behind that drink was most likely Yapon holly, a caffeine-bearing species native not to Cahokia itself, but to regions far to the south and southeast. That distance makes the discovery more than the identification of an ancient stimulant. Leaves or prepared material had to travel hundreds of miles through exchange networks to reach the city. Cahokia was importing not merely an unusual plant, but a substance valuable enough to carry inland toward the center of its ceremonial life. Later historical accounts from indigenous communities of the American Southeast describe a dark, caffeinated beverage that European observers called the black drink. In recorded ceremonies, it could be connected to purification and formal gatherings. The Cahokia beakers date much earlier, roughly between 1050 and 1250 CE, so archaeology cannot assume every later practice occurred there in identical form. But the residues reveal that a related caffeinated drink was already present far north of the plant's natural range, inside vessels whose setting suggests it mattered beyond ordinary thirst. The chemistry was powerful because it did not need to erase consciousness. It sharpened the body while ritual gave that sharpness meaning. Caffeine could intensify wakefulness, alertness, and physical arousal during gatherings. In a city built around plazas, mounds, and sacred performance, a rare imported drink could help separate daily life from moments of collective transformation. Those permitted to hold the beakers may have experienced not merely stimulation, but status, obligation, and entry into an order centered on the city. This is what makes black drink different from the more violent substances deeper in this investigation. It did not need to summon visions or destroy the boundary of reality to become socially potent. A stimulant carried from distant landscapes and presented in distinctive ceremonial vessels could organize people around shared behavior and belief. The drink may have kept bodies awake, while the ceremony around it taught those bodies what the city required them to become: purified, prepared, and bound to an order larger than themselves. Then Cahokia began to empty. Monument buildings slowed, the population diminished, and the urban world that had gathered so many people into one place disappeared as a living center. The holly shrub survived far to the south, and related black drink traditions endured among native peoples. But the exact role of the beverage at Cahokia was lost with the city. No surviving witness explains who drank from those beakers, whether the drink marked burials, alliances, purification, or political obligation. All that remains is pottery and chemistry, elegant cups buried in the ruins of a vanished metropolis, still carrying molecular evidence that leaves from a distant coastal plant once arrived at Cahokia's ceremonial heart. The residues cannot restore the gathering, but they force us to see the city differently. Its power was not built only from earthworks, food stores, or walls. It was also built through rare substances, transported knowledge and experiences controlled by ritual. At Raqefet Cave, fermented drink rested beside the dead before farming began. At Cahokia, a caffeinated brew moved through the living machinery of an urban world that later disappeared. In the bottom of a small clay beaker, archaeology recovered the chemical pulse of a lost city, bitter, dark, carried from far away, and important enough to be consumed in ceremony long before outsiders recorded its name. Number 8. Ancient coca mummies. The stimulant preserved in human hair in the dry landscapes of the Andes. The dead sometimes preserve more than bones, clothing, and offerings. They preserve chemistry. Along the deserts of northern Chile, naturally mummified bodies survive for centuries, and, in some cases, for thousands of years, their hair still attached to heads that had outlasted the lives, ceremonies, and communities around them. When researchers tested those strands, they were searching for the molecular trace of a plant that shaped Andean survival and sacred practice long before the modern world transformed one of its alkaloids into a global drug. Coca. Coca leaves came from plants of the genus Erythroxylum, growing far from many of the cold, high and arid places where their traces have been found. For Andean societies, their value reached beyond ordinary consumption. Coca belonged to travel, labor, offerings, exchange, status and ceremony in landscapes where thin air and difficult journeys shaped human life. Unlike a carved image, hair can store a timeline of exposure as it grows. When coca entered a person's body, a stable metabolic trace called benzoylecgonine could become locked into the hair shaft, waiting long after burial for science to recognize it. In a landmark analysis, researchers examined hair from pre-Columbian mummies in northern Chile, with individuals ranging from roughly 2000 BCE to 1500 CE. Several samples carried evidence consistent with coca leaf consumption. The result was unsettling in its intimacy. A person could die, dry in the desert, and lose every spoken memory of why the plant mattered, yet strands of hair could preserve the fact that coca had passed through their body while they were alive. The grave did not contain merely an object associated with the substance. It contained a human record of its use. Centuries later in Andean history, an even more haunting example survived high above the world. On the summit of Lulailaco, 3 Inca children were placed in a capicocha ceremony more than 500 years ago. Their bodies frozen so completely that hair analysis could reconstruct changes during the final months of their lives. The oldest child, known as the maiden, showed increased coca use as the ceremony approached, alongside evidence of alcohol. The chemicals did not explain everything that happened on that mountain, but they revealed that the final journey towards sacrifice was not only political and religious, it was also shaped through substances given to a living child before she became part of the sacred dead. This is where archaeology becomes difficult to endure. Coca is often reduced in modern imagination to the purified drug, later derived from it. But that collapses very different histories into one word. The ancient evidence points to leaves embedded in an Andean world of offerings, endurance, altitude, authority, and ritual obligation. At the same time, we cannot romanticize what the mummy evidence shows. In the case of children brought to a mountain summit to die, the presence of coca and alcohol raises a grim possibility. Substances with sacred meaning could also help quiet fear, exhaustion, or resistance during a ceremony controlled entirely by others. The hair cannot tell us whether each person welcomed the plant, depended on it for a journey, received it as a privilege, or consumed it within a rite they could not refuse. It records exposure, not intention. That limitation is part of the darkness. Modern analysis can identify a molecule with precision, even map changing consumption over months, while remaining unable to recover the human voice behind the result. The chemistry survives more clearly than consent, belief, or fear. What makes these mummies so powerful is that they turn a plant tradition into direct human evidence. At Cahokia, residue in a cup showed that a stimulant drink entered ceremonial life. In the Andes, the evidence was not held in pottery. It was held inside people. The desert and mountain cold preserved strands of hair as an archive, revealing that coca accompanied lives and deaths across centuries of Andean history. A leaf once carried through valleys and onto sacred peaks remained present after the body fell silent. The modern world learned to isolate cocaine, measure metabolites, and interpret toxicological results. But it did not invent the relationship between coca and human experience. That relationship was already ancient when the mummies were laid down. What disappeared were the conversations, permissions, prayers, and pressures surrounding each dose. What remained was a narrow chemical signature, preserved in fragile hair, proving that a stimulant plant had followed Andean people not merely through work and travel, but into graves where the dead were expected to carry their final transformation forever. Number 7. Jerzancal cannabis. the smoke rising from a mountain cemetery high on the eastern edge of the Pamir Mountains, where the air is thin and the landscape opens into cold stone, wind and snow-fed valleys. Archaeologists excavated a cemetery, unlike an ordinary burial ground. The site is called Zhezankal, in what is now western China, and its tombs date to roughly 2,500 years ago. Around the grave stood rings of dark and pale stones, marking a funerary landscape shaped by people living and moving through the highlands. Yet the most revealing objects were not weapons, jewelry, or carved monuments. They were small wooden braziers, scorched inside, as though something had once been deliberately burned beside the dead. When researchers analyzed the charred residues inside those vessels, they found the chemical signature of cannabis. This was not simply evidence that the plant grew nearby or that seeds had been gathered for fiber or food. The residues showed that cannabis material had been heated in wooden burners, likely with hot stones placed inside to produce smoke. More strikingly, the chemical pattern suggested plants with stronger psychoactive potential than ordinary wild hemp. In a mountain cemetery, mourners or ritual specialists had apparently gathered around graves while cannabis smoke rose into the freezing air. Cannabis has an ancient relationship with humanity, but much of its early history concerns rope, cloth, oil and seed, rather than altered consciousness. Zhezankal matters because it places psychoactive use inside a clear ceremonial setting. These braziers were found among burials, not in a household kitchen or agricultural storeroom. Whatever the participants believed the smoke accomplished, it belonged to death. It may have changed the state of the living during funerary rites, honored the deceased, or helped make contact with a world beyond ordinary experience feel possible. The setting deepens the mystery. The Pamirs are a crossroads of mountains, peoples, and plants, a region where communities moved through harsh elevations and exchanged goods, animals, and ideas across immense distances. Cannabis growing under environmental stress can develop different chemical profiles, and people who repeatedly encountered the plant may have recognized which material produced stronger effects when burned. Another possibility is that valued plants were selected or traded across regions. The residue cannot tell us whether Zhezankal preserved early deliberate selection, or simply expert knowledge of what grew in the highlands. It proves the smoke existed. It does not restore the decisions that carried it into a cemetery. Imagine the ceremony without pretending to know its words. A burial completed beneath a hard mountain sky, wooden vessels placed near the grave, heated stones dropped among plant material, smoke thickening in the cold air as mourners stood within the stone, marked ground, the scent mixing with ash and the presence of a newly buried body. The psychoactive effect may have altered grief, attention, or fear. In a place already isolated by height and silence, the rite could have made the boundary between the visible world and whatever lay beyond it feel dangerously thin. Yet this discovery does not prove that ancient cannabis rites everywhere followed the same meaning. It cannot tell us whether every person present inhaled the smoke, whether the practice belonged only to specialists, or whether cannabis served intoxication, purification, mourning, or several purposes at once. Archaeology often recovers the instrument of an experience while losing its explanation. At Zhezankal, the braziers are real. The burned residue is real, and the chemical evidence is real. The voices of the people who stood over those graves are gone. That absence matters because cannabis later acquired countless identities across the world. Fiber crop, medicine, intoxicant, sacred plant, prohibited substance and commodity. The Zhezankal cemetery does not belong neatly to any modern argument about the plant. It preserves a much older encounter, one in which cannabis smoke entered a funerary world and was important enough to leave specialized vessels among the tombs. Long before later, societies argued over what cannabis should mean. People in the high mountains had already used it in the presence of death. The smoke vanished almost immediately after the ceremony, swallowed by the Pamir wind. But part of it remained as blackened residue inside wood, waiting more than 2 millennia for analysis to reveal it again. Zhezankal exposes one of archaeology's darkest reversals. An altered state meant to last for a moment can survive longer than the society that created it. The mourners disappeared, the ritual language fell silent, and the dead lost their names. Still, inside scorched braziers from a mountain cemetery, the smoke of their ceremony never completely cleared. Number 6. Shumla Cave Peyote. The cactus hidden for 5,000 years in the rock shelters of the Lower Pecos region, where the Rio Grande cuts through dry limestone country between what is now Texas and Mexico, the desert preserved something far smaller than a skeleton and far more revealing than a painted wall. Among museum collections linked to the Shumla caves were shriveled, flattened pieces of cactus, darkened by age and easily mistaken for dead plant debris. They were peyote buttons, the dried tops of Lophophora williamsii, a small spineless cactus, whose appearance gives little warning of the power generations of people would associate with it. Peyote grows low against the ground in the Chihuahuan Desert, almost hiding from the landscape around it. Unlike ceremonial architecture or carved idols, it leaves little evidence unless deliberately gathered and protected. That is why the Shumla specimens matter. When researchers subjected 2 archaeological buttons, believed to have come from Shumla Cave, No. 5, to radiocarbon dating, the results place them deep in prehistory, within the 4th millennium BCE. The results indicate that people in the Lower Pecos region were preserving this cactus roughly 6,000 calendar years ago, long before written history existed there. The remains carried more than age. Chemical analysis detected mescaline in the ancient cactus material. Time had reduced the concentration compared with recent peyote, but the central compound was still there, preserved inside a plant gathered by hands whose language, ceremony, and reasons are gone. This changes the case from suggestion into physical evidence. Archaeologists were not merely looking at an image of a sacred cactus or a later account describing its use. They were holding prehistoric plant remains that still contained the molecule behind peyote's altered state power. Yet chemistry can confirm a substance without explaining a ritual. We do not know exactly how the people connected to Shumla understood the cactus, who was permitted to handle it, or whether these buttons belonged to healing, divination, mourning, initiation, or ceremonial exchange. The rock shelters of the Lower Pecos preserve extraordinary painted worlds, filled with human forms, animals and figures that appear beyond ordinary life. But even when cactus remains and ritual imagery survive in the same wider region, the missing language between them cannot simply be invented. The plant survived. The meaning attached to it did not. That absence is what makes Shumla Cave haunting. Peyote is not a towering or dramatic organism. It grows slowly, close to the dirt, in a desert where survival itself seems severe. For an ancient community to gather its small crowns and preserve them meant that the cactus had already been recognized, selected, and given importance. Somewhere before the evidence we possess, someone discovered that this unassuming plant changed experience profoundly enough to be kept. That first recognition may have emerged through observation, danger, ritual authority, or generations of inherited knowledge. Archaeology can show that it existed thousands of years ago. It cannot return us to the moment it began. Later, peyote history became deeply connected to indigenous ceremonial traditions that endured through colonial violence and suppression. The prehistoric specimens should not be used to collapse those living traditions into one unchanged ritual stretching across millennia. Cultures transform, ceremonies change, and knowledge is carried in ways no dried specimen can preserve. What the Shumla evidence reveals is narrower. Indigenous peoples of the desert borderlands had recognized and preserved peyote's psychoactive significance at an astonishing depth of time. In this investigation, the evidence is not smoke trapped inside a funerary brazier or metabolites sealed within the hair of the dead. It is the plant itself, dried into a small dark button and hidden through millennia, until modern analysis found that its active signature had not entirely vanished. The object is humble in appearance, but the time it contains is immense. Before pyramids rose in Egypt, before the first great cities of Mesopotamia shaped the written world, someone in the deserts of North America handled peyote as something worth carrying forward. The Shumla buttons do not tell us what those ancient people saw, feared, or believed. When the cactus entered their ritual lives, they do not reveal a chant, a guardian, an initiation, or a journey through the unseen. They leave only the quietest possible proof, withered fragments from a cave, still carrying mescaline after thousands of years. Sometimes the most unsettling evidence of a lost ceremony is not a monument built to display it, but a tiny desert plant preserved, because the people who knew its power understood that it mattered. Number 5. Amanita muscaria. The Arctic mushroom behind the winter visions in the northern forests of Eurasia. Winter does not merely change the landscape, it consumes it. Snow closes paths, darkness stretches across the day, and life contracts into firelit shelters. Beneath birch and pine, however, one object appears with impossible brightness. A mushroom with a scarlet cap scattered in white, emerging from the ground like a signal. It is Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, recognized today from fairy tales and decorations, but approached in parts of the Arctic and Siberian world as something far more serious, a substance capable of carrying the mind beyond the limits of the winter body. Unlike peyote preserved as ancient buttons in a dry cave, or cannabis residue burned into funerary wood, the oldest layers of fly agaric use are difficult to prove through one definitive archaeological find. Much of what survives comes through ethnographic accounts and oral traditions among northern peoples, including Siberian ritual use. That distinction matters. Its place in documented northern practice is real, but claims of an unbroken prehistoric ritual must remain more cautious than the legends surrounding it. The chemistry of Amanita muscaria separates it from the better-known visionary plants of the Americas. It does not depend on mescaline or psilocybin. Its principal compounds are ibotenic acid and muscimol, producing effects associated with disorientation, deep dreamlike experience, shifting perceptions of size and movement, sensations of floating or flight, and confused sleep. But the same mushroom can bring nausea, agitation, weakness, seizures, or dangerous poisoning. It offered no clean passage into revelation. It was a threshold guarded by uncertainty. That danger may explain why specialist knowledge mattered. Northern traditions recorded ways in which the mushroom was handled and dried, and some accounts describe active compounds being encountered again after passing through a human or animal body. Reindeer are known to seek fly agaric in the wild, digging through snow for its bright caps, and sometimes behaving strangely afterward. To later observers, this created an unforgettable image: humans, mushrooms, and reindeer, bound together in a winter pharmacology that linked survival with altered states. Yet, whatever rules once governed those practices, they cannot be reduced to a safe method. The mushroom remains hazardous and unpredictable. The landscape gave the experience enormous symbolic force. In a season when the horizon vanished beneath snow and survival depended on animals, fire, and inherited skill, a substance that altered distance, body, and dream could be understood as passage beyond the visible world. A ritual specialist bringing fly agaric into a shelter would not have been carrying a casual intoxicant. The mushroom could enter a controlled ceremony shaped by fear, authority, and expectation, where an altered state might be interpreted as healing, divination, contact with spirits, or endurance through the darkest part of the year. Centuries later, these images drew a modern theory almost too vivid to resist. Some writers proposed that elements of Christmas imagery, red and white colors, reindeer, winter gift, bringers, and roof openings in snowbound dwellings, preserve distant echoes of fly agaric rituals. The parallels are striking, which is why the theory continues to circulate. But resemblance is not proof of direct descent. Santa Claus emerged from many traditions, and no mushroom theory can securely claim his origin. The more honest mystery is not whether Christmas was secretly created by a drug, but why forgotten northern practices can cast such familiar shadows. Amanita muscaria belongs in this investigation because it reveals a different form of disappearance. The mushroom itself never vanished. It still rises beneath northern trees, beautiful and dangerous, as it was to anyone who first recognized its effects. The reindeer still encounter it, and the frozen landscapes that shaped its ritual world still return every year. What time has thinned away is the system of meaning around it, who was permitted to handle it, what dangers were understood, which experiences were considered sacred, and how a community distinguished a vision from poisoning. At Burial Cave, archaeology recovered a cactus carried through thousands of years. With fly agaric, the surviving object is almost more unsettling because it remains openly visible, while the oldest knowledge surrounding it slips into uncertainty. A red mushroom in snow may look like an innocent emblem from childhood. In the northern past, it may have been approached as a doorway, capable of turning winter darkness into vision, and the human body into something strange to itself. The forest still grows the key. The door it once opened has nearly disappeared. Number 4. Wari Vilca beer, the intoxication that may have held an empire together in the dry highlands of Peru, an empire expanded without leaving behind records explaining how distant communities entered its power. The Wari built roads, compounds and ceremonial centers across the Andes centuries before the Inca, creating one of South America's earliest far-reaching political systems. Yet walls and administration alone do not explain how authority entered ordinary lives. At Quilcapampa, on the edge of the Wari world, archaeologists uncovered a more unsettling clue: evidence of communal beer brewing found alongside seeds of a psychoactive tree known as vilca. Vilca comes from Anadenanthera colubrina, a tree whose seeds contain compounds associated with intense altered states. In other Andean traditions, related substances were used in ritual contexts, sometimes through specialized snuffing equipment. The discovery at Quilcapampa is less direct, and therefore more mysterious. Researchers found remains connected to brewing chicha from molly fruit, together with vilca seeds in areas associated with Wari feasting and production. The association raised a possibility that changes the meaning of an imperial banquet. Intoxication may have been woven into gatherings designed to turn visitors into allies, dependents, or believers. This must remain a possibility, not a certainty. Archaeologists have not recovered a sealed Wari cup that proves vilca was mixed into every drink, and seeds found near brewing evidence cannot restore a lost recipe. Yet the seeds matter, because vilca was not a local plant at Quilcapampa. It had to be carried through wider networks into a desert outpost, much like prestige goods and political influence traveled through the empire. A rare psychoactive substance brought to a place of large-scale hospitality was unlikely to be meaningless refuse. It belonged to a world in which plants could mark access to distant landscapes and invisible powers. Feasting gave rulers a form of authority that armies could not provide. A host who offered food and chicha created obligation. A host who offered an extraordinary ritual experience could attach awe to that obligation. Alcohol gathered people into a shared moment, softened boundaries, and made the generosity of the provider impossible to ignore. If vilca entered that setting, whether combined with drink or consumed during the same ceremonies, the feast could become more than celebration. It could become a controlled encounter with an altered state, opened by those whose political power was expanding. Imagine the scene only as far as the evidence permits. Wary officials hosting guests in a remote Andean settlement. Ceramic cups arranged for a feast. Chicha poured amid music, food, and formal exchange, while imported vilca stood nearby as a substance known to carry special force. Guests may have understood the gathering as alliance, hospitality, sacred participation, or submission to a more powerful order. The experience did not need to be violent to reshape loyalty. A ceremony that overwhelmed the senses could remain in memory long after a demand for tribute was made. This is what makes the case darker than the simple discovery of an ancient intoxicant. Ritual substances are often imagined as personal pathways to vision, but in organized societies access can be controlled. The person who possesses a rare plant decides who receives it, in what setting, and under whose authority. At a Wari feast, altered consciousness may have reinforced social hierarchy as much as spiritual experience. What appeared to be generosity could also have been a demonstration that the empire controlled not only goods and roads, but encounters with powers people believed were beyond the ordinary world. The lost knowledge is precisely the part archaeology cannot recover. We can identify vilca seeds, recognize botanical traces of chicha production, and reconstruct a settlement where Wari newcomers gathered people for communal drinking. We cannot know whether vilca entered the beverage itself, whether it was taken separately, who was allowed to receive it, or what explanation followed the experience. The objects reveal a relationship between intoxication, distance, and political hospitality, while the ceremony that gave that relationship meaning remains absent. The Wari eventually vanished as an imperial world, leaving compounds, broken vessels, and scattered remains of the plants they valued. At Jurzankal, smoke rose beside the dead. At Shumla Cave, a cactus survived hidden through millennia. At Quilcapampa, the evidence hints at something more calculating. A rare mind, altering substance placed close to the cup of an empire. The vilca seeds cannot prove exactly what every guest drank, but they preserve an unsettling possibility: that one of the ways ancient power held people together was by controlling the moments when ordinary reality seemed to fall away. Number 3. Chav-en-Dehu-Ta. The temple built around altered mines high in the Peruvian Andes. Long before the Inca ruled the mountains, people traveled toward a ceremonial center designed to overwhelm them. Chav-en-Dehu-Ta drew pilgrims from distant highland routes into a world of carved, fanged beings, echoing stone passages and ceremonies controlled by specialists whose authority reached far beyond the temple walls. To enter Chav-en was not simply to visit a sacred place. It was to step into an architecture built to make the ordinary world unstable. The oldest visual clue was carved into stone. On one famous relief, a supernatural figure holds a tall ribbed cactus recognizable as San Pedro, an Andean plant associated with mescaline. The image placed a psychoactive plant beside a transformed, powerful being inside a major ancient American religious center. For decades, that carving suggested altered consciousness belonged to Chav-en ritual life. But a carved cactus can only suggest what people valued. It cannot prove what entered a human body inside the temple. The darker evidence came from ritual equipment. Archaeologists recovered bone tubes from ceremonial contexts at Chav-en, and residue analysis revealed traces associated with psychoactive plants, including nicotine from wild tobacco relatives and compounds linked to vilca or anadinanthera. These were not objects lost in an ordinary dwelling. They belonged to a center where ritual leaders managed access, movement, and experience. They do not prove every visitor was drugged. They show something more precise. Mind-altering substances were physically present inside an organized religious system, built around transformation. Chav-en's architecture makes that discovery feel deliberate. Its interior galleries are narrow, dark, and confusing, with passages turning into one another beneath massive stone. Water channels and enclosed corridors may have intensified sound into roars and echoes moving through the structure itself. Carved heads showed faces shifting from human to animal, with fangs and wide eyes suggesting bodies crossing into another state. To a pilgrim already frightened, exhausted from travel, fasting, or exposed to an unfamiliar substance, the temple could have become a living machine of revelation. This was not necessarily ritual in the gentle sense. An altered state inside a controlled environment gives power to the people who control the setting. The specialists of Chav knew where the passages led, when sounds would arrive, which objects would be revealed, and which substances entered the ceremony. A visitor did not. If that person emerged shaken, convinced they had encountered an animal spirit, an ancestor, or divine authority, the experience would not merely alter private belief. It would confirm the power of those who had guided them into the darkness and allowed them to return. San Pedro remains part of the mystery because its carved presence is unmistakable, and its long-lasting effects would have suited ceremonies unfolding over many hours. Yet the direct residue evidence points towards substances associated with snuffing rather than proving one complete cactus ritual formula. The temple may have drawn on several plants and several forms of altered experience. Chav-en was not necessarily built around one secret drug. It may have been built around specialist control of the mind itself. What has disappeared is the sequence that once gave the experience meaning. We do not know who entered the galleries, whether substances were offered willingly or required, how doses were judged, what words were spoken before darkness closed around the participant, or what explanation awaited them when they emerged. The tubes survive, the carvings survive, the corridors still turn beneath the stone, but the ceremony connecting them has been torn apart by time. That loss is why Chav-en-Dehu-Ta stands so high in this list. The evidence suggests something more engineered than the simple presence of a valued plant, a sacred center where plants, sound, darkness, and fear could be assembled into a controlled encounter with another reality. The altered mind was not merely present at the ritual. It may have been one of the temple's most powerful creations. The people who built Chav-en left no written explanation for the experience offered behind its walls. They left fanged gods, hidden galleries, bone tubes, and molecular traces of plants that could change perception. Together, those fragments reveal a disturbing possibility. More than 2,000 years ago, in a temple high in the Andes, religious power may have depended on knowing how to lead a human mind into darkness, reshape what it believed it had seen, and send it back into daylight carrying obedience as revelation. Number 2. Yopo snuff. The bone tubes that opened another world across the deserts and highlands of South America. Archaeologists have recovered objects that look almost too intimate to have survived: carved trays, small mortars and hollow bone tubes shaped for ritual use. They were not ordinary tools. They belonged to ceremonies involving powdered preparations made from anadnanthera seeds, substances known in later traditions by names including yopo and vilca. Whatever the people who used them believed they were approaching, they carried the doorway in objects small enough to be placed inside a grave. The tree itself gives little warning of the world built around it. Anadnanthera produces hard seeds containing powerful tryptamine compounds, especially bufotenine, and preparations associated with it could produce abrupt, overwhelming altered states. Archaeology cannot recreate an identical ancient dose or prove every ceremony followed the same form. What it can show is that people deliberately designed specialized equipment for a substance whose purpose extended far beyond food or ordinary medicine. These were instruments meant to change consciousness inside a controlled social setting. In the wider Andes, inhalation paraphernalia reaches back more than 4,000 years. The artifacts are striking because they preserve the physical structure of the rite. A tray held the prepared material. A tube focused its delivery. Some tubes were made for a person to use directly, while other forms suggest that a second participant could administer the substance. In either case, the ritual was not simply about possessing a plant. It was about crossing a threshold through an object built for that exact moment. That structure changes the meaning of the experience. With a drink, a participant can lift a vessel with their own hands, but a rite using a tube could make the transformation sudden and personal, sometimes dependent on another person standing close enough to control when the encounter began. The participant surrendered not only to a substance, but to the specialist, partner or authority who possessed the equipment, the knowledge and the timing. Trust was not merely part of the symbolism, it was built into the ceremony itself. Accounts from later periods help explain why such control mattered. Yopo-like preparations were associated with intense physical distress, disorientation and visions interpreted within communities as communication with spirits, ancestors or forces unavailable to ordinary perception. To an outsider, such an event might look like poisoning followed by hallucination. Within a ritual world, the suffering could mark the crossing, as though the body had to be overwhelmed before the mind could enter a realm reserved for healers, diviners, or religious specialists. Danger and revelation were never cleanly separated. This is why the tubes found in graves and shelters are more disturbing than a simple plant remain. A seed can tell us what grew. A tube tells us that people developed a technology around what the seed did to the human mind. Someone knew which objects to carve, which ceremonies justified their use, and which people could be trusted to guide the experience. The equipment survived because bone and wood can endure under dry conditions. The training that made those objects meaningful vanished with the people who carried it. Yopo also reveals how altered states could become instruments of authority. A person who controlled the ritual substance could claim access to healing, prophecy, ancestors, or divine instruction. Someone emerging shaken from an overwhelming encounter might accept the interpretation given by those who guided it. The tube was not merely a delivery tool, it could decide who was permitted to cross beyond ordinary awareness, and who had the power to explain what waited there. Modern analysis can identify compounds associated with anadnanthera and compare ancient paraphernalia with surviving traditions, but it cannot restore the ceremony from fragments. The original meanings, restrictions and safeguards are gone. The evidence proves that people deliberately engineered encounters with altered consciousness deep in the South American past. It does not return the knowledge that once made those encounters understandable. At Chaven, psychoactive substances appeared inside a temple designed to shape fear and belief. With Yopo, the mystery becomes smaller, closer, and somehow more terrifying. A carved bone tube, a hidden ritual preparation, and another human being waiting beside you as the ordinary world was about to collapse. Thousands of years later, the instruments remain, polished by hands we cannot name. They do not tell us what the participants saw. They tell us that someone once knew how to open the door, and that the knowledge of what lay beyond it was buried with the people who held the key. Number 1. The Bolivian Shaman's Pouch. The drug kit buried for 1,000 years, the final discovery did not emerge from a temple or royal tomb. It came from a bundle hidden in the dry shelter of Cueva del Chileno, high in southwestern Bolivia, where the Andean climate preserved objects left behind roughly 1,000 years ago. Inside a leather bag, archaeologists found carved wooden tablets, a snuffing tube, spatulas, and a pouch stitched from animal snouts. It was portable and deliberate, as though its owner carried not one substance, but an entire system for entering worlds ordinary consciousness could not reach. When scientists analyzed the residues inside that bundle, they found chemical evidence connected to cocaine, benzoylecgonine, bufotenine, harmine and dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. These compounds do not point to one plant gathered outside the shelter. They imply botanical sources drawn from different ecological zones, including plants linked to coca and Nadananthera preparations and psychoactive brews. Someone had protected a collection of powerful substances brought across landscapes separated by altitude and distance. The pouch was the surviving inventory of specialist knowledge. It is tempting to call this the earliest direct evidence of ayahuasca, because harmine and DMT form the pairing most strongly associated with that brew. But the evidence demands restraint. Residue inside a ritual pouch does not prove that those compounds were combined into one drink, or even consumed in the same ceremony. The owner may have kept different preparations for different purposes. What the pouch proves is more unsettling. By around 1,000 years ago, an Andean ritual specialist possessed substances capable of altering the human mind in radically different ways. The owner likely lived within exchange networks connected to the Tiwanaku world, whose influence reached toward tropical lowlands. Many of the plants implied by the residues could not have grown at the cold, dry altitude where the bundle was found. To assemble this kit, people needed roots, trading relationships, and knowledge of distant botanical materials. The power inside the pouch was therefore not simply chemical. It was social and geographic, showing that access to altered states could depend on networks of authority and exchange. The objects reveal how carefully that power was carried. The carved tablet and tube point toward inhaled preparations related to wider Andean traditions, in which psychoactive powders were associated with divination, healing, or contact with the unseen. The leather pouch protected materials that would otherwise have vanished, while its unusual construction marked it as separate from ordinary possessions. This does not look like casual experimentation. It looks like the equipment of someone whose status depended on understanding experiences others may have approached with fear. Yet the most important part of that knowledge is exactly what archaeology cannot recover. Chemical analysis can identify molecules, but it cannot tell us which substance was used first, who received it, what words were spoken, or what the owner believed happened once its effects began. It cannot reveal whether these preparations were intended to heal, initiate, terrify, or command obedience. The pouch preserved the instruments of transformation while allowing the ceremony itself to disappear. That silence makes the discovery darker than one plant found in a cave. At Raqefet, fermentation may have gathered mourners beside the dead. At Cahokia, a stimulant drink entered the ritual life of a vanished city. At Jerzankal, cannabis smoke rose among mountain graves. At Charven and within Yopo traditions, substances and ritual equipment may have helped authorities guide altered minds. The Bolivian pouch gathers those themes into one final object: trade, specialist power, and multiple psychoactive materials concentrated in the hands of one unknown person. Whoever owned the bundle died without leaving an explanation. Their voice is gone, and the community that understood the kit cannot be restored by laboratory analysis. But the residues endured. 1,000 years later, they reveal that ancient South American ritual knowledge was organized and mobile enough to bring substances from distant worlds together inside one protected bundle. The most haunting artifact in this investigation is not a flower, a mushroom, or a cup. It is the container, a leather pouch carried by someone who knew how to use what was inside, then left behind until only its chemistry remained. Science can name the molecules and suggest the plants from which they came. It cannot reopen the ritual or return the meaning that once made those substances powerful. The pouch survived. The person who held it vanished. With them disappeared the knowledge of which door they believed they were opening whenever they reached inside.